now. So you're good to go.
Perfect. That sounds good. All right. Well, welcome everybody to today's session. I think we've been planning this for almost 6 months, and who would have anticipated all the interesting things that have happened since March? So hopefully you'll find this session to be an interesting diversion and also a technical learning experience. Today we'll be learning how you can quickly pour out a small amount of Python and Flask and create beautiful applications on your IBM I. So you'll come away with a skill that you can use tomorrow or even yet today. If you're on the Pacific time zone or you're working late, you can try some of this out. So my name is Richard Schoen. I've been a developer on IBM I since its release in 1988. I still remember being at the announcements when the system was announced and they had fireworks on stage. Prior to that, I worked for a couple of years on System 36 for about 4 years, developing an RPG2, so quite a storied background. In 1990, I founded and ran a company called RJS Software Systems for 24 years, and then my partner decided to retire in 2014 and we sold the business. And I developed most of the RJS report distribution and document management and workflow products. So quite a bit of IBM I and Windows development background, and since then Linux as well. I currently work for a company called Pegasystems. So Pega creates, it kind of fit my niche. They create low-code software for creating workflow applications and process automation. They have a technology called RPA. If you haven't heard of it, it's for interacting with screens. They call it robotic process automation and utilizing existing screen-based applications when there might not be APIs available. And then they also do marketing and CRM and call center automation as well. So kind of an interesting company to work for. So I went from working for a small company to working for a publicly traded company with over 5,000 employees. So it's definitely been an experience for me after working for myself for several years. All right, this is just kind of a point of note. It's fun to talk about my journey a little bit. So my journey on integration and development started back in the 80s. So back when I worked on the System 36, I did my first integration between a DOS Turbo Pascal application and a 5250 screen, so using screen scraping. And look at all the connectivity things that have sort of come and gone in between. A lot of them have stayed, but it's definitely interesting. I look at that year when I started back in 1984 to sort of where we are today, and it's been one of the coolest and most eventful computing eras, and it's so much fun to be involved in it, and it's still moving as well. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. I have a couple of young kids in their lifetime as they grow up. They started as touchscreen generation when they were born about 13 years ago, and they have a totally different perspective on technology than we did back in the 80s. So, but it's definitely fun to sort of be part of this journey. And even after 30 plus years, I'm still excited about technology. It's a lot of fun to be doing this, and hopefully you all feel the same way, or you wouldn't be coming here for a Python class. All right, so before we dive in, we'll talk a little bit about why you should consider Python and Flask for IBM I development. Then we'll provide just a quick overview. There's so much online material on Python and Flask, so really I'm going to provide some context and also how it relates throughout the whole presentation. I try and relate analogies back to RPG or CL programming as well. So if any of you doing IBM I stuff, RPG stuff, can sort of visualize how things work in Python and Flask versus RPG. After that, we'll develop our first Flask application on the desktop. And we'll also add a little web service to it as well, so you can see how quickly it is to surface your data from the IBM I into a Python web application or service. And then we'll deploy our application or show it deployed on the IBM I. And so you can actually, at some point, maybe you choose not to develop on the desktop anymore. You could maintain and actually actively develop it from the IFS on the I as well. So that's kind of nice. So as we were talking about a little earlier, so I will pause for questions along the way if you have them. Enter them in the chat window, and Laura, if you can keep an eye on that. Also, if you want to ask one out loud, feel free to interrupt me. But as I mentioned, I might parking lot it till the end, depending on if it's a yes, no, maybe, very short answer type of thing, or it's in context with where we're at in the presentation. I'll answer it. Otherwise, I'll parking lot those and we'll hit them at the tail end of the presentation. All right, so why would you consider Python and Flask? So this is always, language wars are always fun, but I think after 30 years of development and seeing stuff come and go as far as languages go, I tend to be somewhat language agnostic these days, which means I'll work in whatever language makes sense for the task at hand or for the customer that I'm working with. Obviously today choices of Node and PHP and Ruby and Java, Python, RPG, C#, and Rust. There's all kinds of new stuff that keeps showing up. So we're really not planning to debate any merits of Python over other languages. Today is really about dipping you just a little bit into Flask and Python, and then determining if this flavor agrees with your fingers when you're doing development, right? So, does this work for me? I know I plan to do a little bit, especially in context with IBM I plan to do a lot more with Python because it is really easy to push out applications and functionalities. My point of view is if you find it interesting to develop an IBM web application with Python, here's how to do it. So nothing about language wars or anything like that. Python specifically, this is more just sort of an aside, I guess, but in addition to what we're covering, we're not going to cover this today, but just so you're aware of it, Python can also be used to create cool command line applications and can be called and consumed from RPG and CL programs as well. So, example there might be you want to write a database export application to Excel, or I've done some integration with Office 365 and things like Salesforce. There's APIs available for interacting with those components and services. And then one of the things I wrote, I do a bit of open source. So if you ever go out to GitHub and search my name, you'll find I have a project called PYONI, so PYONI, which has a CL command in it called PYRun, which allows you to take a Python script that you've built, put it in the IFS, and then run it from a CL or an RPG program, and then bring back the data, much like you would do for a call parm. Even though you're making a process call or a call across process boundaries, it's very cool because you can actually call one of those processes, know that it's succeeded, or even bring data back right into an RPG or a CL application. So potential IBM use cases, this is probably with most modernization, right? Probably the most common thing I hear is people want to query and present data, or maybe they're doing dashboards in today's world. You'll see a little bit. I actually, the template that I'm using uses an HTML framework called Bootstrap, and then there's a lot of open source graphing tools as well. So there's a couple of sample graphs in there as well in the HTML. So you'll see that, you can do a dashboard perhaps. Nowadays we have the IBM DB2 services, so things like where I started, I cut my teeth back in the day on spool file management. You could write an OutQ viewer or maybe a job viewer, or use any of the other DB2 services and surface that information in a web application, right? Maybe you want some sort of control panel into your backend processes. Maybe you want to do a file manager where you want to upload and download files into the IFS. I see people doing that now. And let's say you don't want to spend money on a third-party software product, you can do that. Or maybe even a web-based editor or a file viewer using one of the cool JavaScript controls that are out there nowadays too. So one example I'm kind of working on now using Python is I'm creating a viewer. I wrote a component called iForget, which is a lightweight Git client that's a CL command, and I'm writing a viewer around that so people can actually view their source changes in the IFS. But Python and Flask are just a great way to build those lightweight interfaces. And with the template that I provide you, you'll be able to do it in a matter of minutes. In fact, you'll be able to do it instantly because you'll be able to load this up and plug in an ODBC connection, and you'll be able to see it actually work right away if you load our solution up on your Eye or in Visual Studio. Well, a couple of things I don't like, and this is opinion. So back in the early days, so since I was around in the early days, I suppose not of ARPANET, that was the early days of the internet, but in the late 90s when the internet came to pass, there used to be these debates about typed languages versus non-typed, and typed means that, like, if I have an integer, it's typed as an integer. If it's a character field, it's typed as a character. Well, things like Node and PHP and Python, they don't do variable typing. One of the issues I have with that is I'm used to using things like C#, where the precompiler tells me if I have anything wrong before I ever even run my program. In the case of something like Python, one of the things you do have to do is really understand what variables you're using and what they're being used for and that sort of thing. So, because there is no precompiler, you're basically building a script and running it, and then you make sure that everything works, which means that you have to test every option that's in your application. And I don't know, this would actually be a good question if anybody out here is doing Python. how you're handling your QA testing, but I think QA testing becomes very important when you're doing something like Python, because you got to be able to test every angle that you might hit this application with and make sure that everything works. And not that you don't have to do it in other languages either, but I tend to like pre-compilers because I'm what I call a fast coder, which means I like to write code, test, and run, and the pre-compiler catches me and doesn't let me break things, whereas I can very easily when I'm doing it in Python. So it's also a good thing too. I can write code faster in some cases if I'm doing simple scripts too. So there are pluses to that as well. But overall, I think it's been, for me, it's been a fun language to work with. A couple of similarities, and I'll point these out along the way as we go through our sample application. So you're going to see the way Flask works, and I'll explain what Flask is in a moment, but the way it works is that when you write your web program or your web application, the way I think of it anyways is as you have a single main line, much like you would if you were doing an interactive RPG program. And then there's screen change, they call them, the term is used routes. You'll see this when we look at it, but it's the concept very similar to using execute format. You're always outputting a specific screen, or in our case, a specific web page based on where you're at. So you'll see it's very similar to execute format. So if you think about how execute format works in RPG, you'll have a pretty good idea how Flask works to some extent. Little different syntax, but works the same way. And then functions. Think of sub-procedures. If you're doing sub-procedures, the idea is to sort of wrap all your code in functions. And you'll see how we did that today with since we're using actually 2 databases in the sample that we're doing, we're going to use a DB2. So we're going to hook up to IBM I using the IBM I access driver. And then we're also going to use SQLite, which is actually a lightweight database that probably if you have a cell phone, you have a SQLite database on there somewhere. But it's cool because you can actually use Python and your web apps so that SQLite database can be used. Here's a use case where I've got a thing in mind that I'm going to use it for our customer. Is they have mobile devices, and what they want to do is actually export orders to a mobile device so that they can take them out in the field. And not related to today's topic, but just something to think about. But the idea would be every day, every morning before a driver goes out, they'd run a little process that runs a little Python thing to export to a SQLite database, then take that database onto a device, go offline all day and do their work and collect orders because they're in some interesting locations. And then at the end of the day, be able to sync those orders once they come into a connectivity spot or a VPN connection. They can upload that data directly from the mobile device back to the system, or just drop that file off and then actually have a Python process that reads the data. So anyways, kind of a cool use case. I've become really fond of SQLite and more so in replacement to Access databases. I do some Windows programming too, where we used to use Access databases, but SQLite is really cool multi-purpose, non-server-based database. It's much like an Access file, or if you think of the old DBase days. All right, so enough of that segue, but hopefully you get an idea of similarities. We'll point those out. Any questions so far? Maybe I'll stop and see if I've got any ideas flowing, or are we just ready to move on?
Is that Access SQLite? Does that run under Android?
Yeah, it'll run under. You can use it on an Android device or iOS. And then also it'll run typically in the browser. I think they've changed. There's a name. It's like WebDB or something like that. It's called. I don't do a lot of mobile stuff yet, but I think they changed the name there. But it's essentially the same code under the covers too. And what's nice about it is when you distribute, like if you're going to use it like we are in a database, there's like one little DLL that Windows uses, or like on the Android, I think you develop in Java or whatever, but it's a very, very light footprint for that database, even for distributing any runtime stuff. And on the IBM I, there's Python libraries that we install. So, as long as you're running a Python script, you can actually interact. And you'll see here it's ambidextrous, the way we built it out. This app that we're going to give you today, you can actually run it with SQLite. I created a sample table in a SQLite database, and you can run it natively. So that's pretty cool. All right, so I know we have, so I think in terms of connectivity, and I'll dive into this a little more when we talk about deploying natively, but we now have on IBM I, and hopefully most of you have seen this in the news, but there's a native. So think if we had client access 400 back in the days, and still do, it's IBM I access now, but there's an ODBC driver that we can use to talk to the database. There's also a native version now that runs natively on IBM I and can also be used in conjunction with Python. One of the reasons I like that driver, it came out in late 2018, early 2019 from IBM. But what's nice is whatever code you write on your PC to access IBM I, you can take it, as we're going to do, and lift that and just drop it right in the IFS and run it. You just have a different ODBC connection string. But I really like that because I've been using ODBC for the last 15 years doing other platform development. The iToolkit component is there. It uses a service called XML Service, which is what IBM did to sort of expose some of the unique functionalities of the IBM I, like program calls and CL commands, data queues, that sort of stuff, and also some SQL. But it's more non-standard, and I'm trying to stick with things that I consider are standard long-term. And Alan and I will talk about that a little more when we do our PHP session next week as well, because there's a shift there towards using the IBM I access driver now as well. So while the iToolkit has some cool stuff, we're not covering it today, but just take note of that, because that is something you can do if you want. But I found that I can also do program calls and things like that from ODBC. So I'll do some future add-on examples probably that show you how to do that type of stuff. And then, of course, accessing through web services. So we'll show you how to you can actually you can interact with web services to bring data into your application. In our case, the web service we're doing is actually surfaced from our application. So we're creating a web service, not consuming it. But for the most part, everything we're doing is going to be using the IBM I access driver and then also the SQLite. So you get to see that in action. All right, I just copied this from the Flask website. So, and I'll just read it because it's so Flask is a lightweight, and I'll explain WSGI, but basically a web application framework designed to get started quickly with the ability to scale up to complex applications. And so they began this as a small wrapper project. And I love all these acronyms. This is the fun part with open source, like work, zig, and Jinja, right? And you're like, what? So I'll explain what those are, but it's essentially the templating languages that you can use with your HTML. They have some interesting names, but so it's become one of the most popular web application frameworks for Python, and it also lets you do what I like is there's a lot of web frameworks that force you to do certain things, like you have to use certain database access conventions and things like that. And so it's kind of wide open for you to make your own interpretations. And so the example that I put together is sort of framework that you can use as a starting point and then tweak it as you feel needed when you're building these applications. But ultimately think of it as the ability to web enable your Python applications. And so here's where an analogy comes in for RPG now. If this were RPG, what would we use to web enable that? That might be simple. We might just use CGI, right? So it's really kind of like CGI for Python. So the idea that you can serve up web applications and they're single threaded. So every time you do an interaction, it goes in, does some business logic and returns data, and then it goes to sleep until the next transaction comes in. So very similar. If you've done CGI and RPG, you'll really probably like Flask and take to it nicely. I know I did it in my case, and I've done a lot of CGI programming. So a couple of the acronyms, and there are many more. So Flask we just talked about, WSGI. So this is just, it's kind of it's a standard for doing Python integration to the web, and you'll see where that's used in a second in a couple of the other frameworks that put stuff out on the web. Jinja, which is an HTML template framework, allows you, what I like about it is it's cool. I can actually, so an example it would be, and we'll show this, but I could do a query using SQL, and then go in when it hits my template, I can actually have a little loop in my template that's outputting a list or a grid or a subfile, so to speak, of HTML. So it becomes a very simple page, as you'll see when we look at our list sample. And then so this WorkZig was a WSGI application library that Flask was originally built around. So it would be interesting to find out. I didn't take the time to go in, but where some of these names sort of come from. But we're all coming up with interesting concepts when we name our applications. There's usually something personal about those. So there's another framework, and this goes back to, so why not Django? So I have not used, Django is the other popular alternative to Flask. It's got an admin panel built in. There's a ORM, which is sort of a high-level wrapper around database calls and that sort of stuff, and it enforces a certain structure for your application. So probably worth checking out if you're going to develop more web applications in Python. But for our purposes, I like Flask because it's simple, flexible, and fine-grained, which means I get to do what I want with it. And so that's really why I like Flask. But so some people, if you've done Python, might be thinking that already. But and then there's probably merits to that as well. But I really haven't had a need to work with it in the stuff that I've done so far. So we'll look at this. We're actually going to do a hello world application in a second. But this is probably the bare minimum Flask application that you can do. So essentially you have, so we were talking about execute formats. So in the concept of the Flask world, anything you pass in as a URL, or let's say I click a link that passes in a URL, comes in as what they call a route. And for lack of a better term, think of it as it's doing like a case statement or an if then else statement to determine what it's going to output. And so what it does in this case, the way it's defined is it says, so if they go to the root of this website, this is a function called hello that's associated with that root, and it does this logic. So it's kind of like actually having subroutines, or based on the URLs they get passed in, and you'll see how we actually stack them in the application. Whereas the first thing, anytime you click a button or go to a URL, the first thing that happens is it looks at what came in as the URL, and based on what came in, that's the screen it's going to execute. Again, much like your execute format, you make determinations on where you're at in the application, and then you output the appropriate screen. And then this just shows how easy it is to run the application. You'll see this when we look at the IBM I, a single command line just to start the web application, or at least the development web application server. You'll see in Visual Studio when you do it, we actually hit a button and it starts it for us automatically. So it's kind of nice when you're doing development. But that's the bare minimum that you actually have to know to do Flask. And what I found is I've been learning it probably off and on for the last year and a half, probably the last 6 months working on various web applications. But there's still lots of bits and pieces that you learn along the way. And I guess that's like anything. You peel back the onion as you need to, and hopefully this will give you a good peel after today where you've got some stuff that you can work with very quickly. It's always fun to do a little chart, so you can see the interaction and how it works. So obviously, here we have a web browser, client makes a request, the web server's sitting there waiting to do something, perform some logic on the route like we just looked at, might interact with a database or some IFS files, and then returns a response that goes back out to the browser. So probably nothing new if you've been doing web application development, or no real magic. The magic is really in whatever code that you actually put in your routes for the most part. And then Flask is really just there for you, which is really nice. And then serves up the application for you. So essentially, in terms of like if you're doing a production deployment, so typically there's a combination. I think that's probably most popular nowadays in the open source world. If you're doing Node or PHP or Python nowadays, typically Nginx is a new web server that's kind of a replacement for Apache. So a lot of customers that I've talked to are actually starting to use that rather than using Apache. But so the combination of this G-Unicorn, which is actually a Python-based server, so it's a standalone server written in Python, and then you front end it to the web if you need to with Nginx, that becomes your production deployment. And so we're not talking about going live today, but if you Google those two terms, you'll have plenty of examples that show you how to use Nginx and G-Unicorn to set it up to go into production. And then there's a couple of these other acronyms. There's one called UWSGI, which is a server that's written in C. There's another one called G-Event, and this one I like, Twisted Web. There's also a functionality called Fast CGI, which can work in conjunction with Apache if you use the Apache Fast CGI module. There's also a module called mod WSGI for Apache, but I read somewhere, I saw it was kind of timely on one of the lists today. I don't think that's been ported to IBM I. So more than likely, you're going to use Nginx and this G-Unicorn, and then if you're just doing development, you'll use what we showed today, which is just running the built-in development server. And when you get the slide deck, there's actually a link on the bottom of it. I think it's cut off at the bottom of my slide deck, but there's a whole site on the actual Flask site. There's several pages that talk about deploying your applications into production. But it's still pretty straightforward. All right, so this is where we're going to spend probably most of our time today. So requirements, if you're going to do this, I've already got it installed, so we won't be installing it. But Visual Studio community the Visual Studio in general has made a lot of cool changes in the last several years. Number one is that they used to have sort of a hobbled version of Visual Studio that they would give you, and since I'd say over the last 5, 6, 7 years, they've introduced what they call the Community Edition, which is, for all intents, what I call Visual Studio Professional, which means it's a full version of Visual Studio. But what they've actually added the ability to do PHP development in here and actually run it and debug it, just like you would with Visual Basic and C#, and the same thing with Python as well. So they've done a great job, and I think this is kind of a sleeper, especially in the IBMI community. I don't know that a lot of people use it. I do, only because, you know, I've been doing Visual Studio development since 1993, so I've been doing it for a long time, and I've always liked Microsoft stuff. They've always made it easy to use. That being said, I'll show you a list of editors in a second that you can choose from for your environment if you choose not to use Visual Studio. Ultimately, you don't even need a special editor. You could even use, theoretically, the green screen, but I don't encourage anybody to do green screen programming if you're building Python applications. And then you would install the IBMI Access Windows package. So typically, if you're installing the emulator, it doesn't have the ODBC driver. There's a separate download on the IBMI site, or to be able to download this. And then there's also one like for the paste driver, which we'll talk about in a little while when we talk about native deployment. And then, so you have things like Visual Code. I guess I got that wrong. That's a cool one. That must be a new one. But a Visual Studio Code, that's become a pretty popular editor nowadays. PyCharm, I know a lot of developers that like that version. You can use Eclipse, which is similar to RDI. I even know people that have actually, if they use RDI for their RPG development, they've plugged this PyDev plugin into RDI and used it for Python development. So you can use RDI if you want to. And then there's another one called Lyclips, and I didn't put it in here, but there's another site that has like 20 alternatives for Python development. And even if you like Notepad++, you have the ability to do Python development and something like that too, or the Windows Notepad. So, you know, sort of pick your poison, but for today's purposes, we're going to be using Visual Studio. All right, enough slideware, right? Let's look at some stuff. 1 second there. Oh, alrighty. Here we go. We got Visual Studio, and good, it didn't cut off the bottom. We can still sort of see our icons, but I don't think we'll have anything important down there that we need to see. 1 second, I just want to kill that. There we go. All right, so if you were using Visual Studio, actually one of the first things maybe we'll show. Let's see if it's hooked up outside of my project. Yeah, so I downloaded this. I Googled and found this a while ago because we're going to be using SQLite. I always like to have some sort of, you know, like on IBMI, we'd use Start SQL, or we'd use DBU or some other utility to access our data. I like this guy. This is a plugin that you can get for free if you just search out SQLite and SQL Server Compact Toolbox. This is the plugin for Visual Studio. There's also utilities like dbeaver and, you know, some of those other database utilities that all support SQLite. But in our case, for our SQLite stuff, you'll see I recreated the popular QCUS-CDT table in SQLite. So we'll just say edit top 200 rows. So you'll see it's real nice. You can actually go and enter data or query data here as well, and sort of see, like, if you're making updates into the table and stuff. So built into Visual Studio, you just have, if you're doing SQLite, you've got a way to see the data. If you're over in IBMI, you probably would be using the SQL utilities or the IBM ACS SQL client, or, you know, whatever your favorite IBMI data viewing tool is. But if you choose to play around with SQLite more, definitely good to have this particular application plugged into Visual Studio. All right, so let's go ahead and we're going to do a new application. So let's just say I was just getting started. I just installed Visual Studio and I'm going to do my first application. So there's a whole bunch of different types. You can do PowerShell apps, that sort of stuff, but we're just going to look for Flask. And you'll see there's a couple of variations of Flask, but we're going to focus on a Flask web project. The nice thing about this is it creates an empty application with everything that you need to get started. So Flask, also so we're using a HTML framework called Bootstrap, which is very popular, which is nice because you don't have to be a designer to use it. You can do simple HTML statements and make good looking code, as you'll see with our example. So we're going to do a Flask web project and select that, and we'll just call it, do I have maybe I don't have Flask project 1, so we'll do that one. We'll just go ahead and create this guy. All right, so by default, it creates, so Flask has sort of a structure in which it creates your application, and you'll see this when we do our other one as well. But so you've got, this is actually a directory up top here. All your Python add-ins, so like in our case, we're using Flask, and we're using there's the Jinja template. These are all libraries that can get loaded automatically when you set it up. So like there's the ODBC connection component as well. And so the idea is that your project typically has access to all those, or you go in, you can load them. So like if I was going to right click, I say, I want to manage my Python packages. And let's say I hadn't installed ODBC yet. I can go search for it, and then I could pick to install it right here, and it'll automatically install it into my project. So it uses a utility called pip, which on the if you're working in Linux or AIX or Mac or IBM iNative, you would typically use that, but they've made it nice and graphical, so you can just pick it. If I was using SQLite like we are, I probably would go pick SQLite 3, I think is the one we want. And you would install this PY SQLite 3 right here. And we've already done it, so I'm not going to do it again. But just so when you watch this video, you'll kind of know how to start adding packages. The example that I provide, actually, I think will automatically load these already because I'll have this packaged up. So I think it'll have all this stuff already loaded when you install it. But anyway, so that's how you load dependencies that you might need. And then there's a directory here. So this structure. So starting with, I'll just go through the structure of the application. When you run your Python application, if it's a web application, you would, over in the eye, you'll see this when we run it. But if you remember when we looked at our hello world component, this is what actually starts our development web server. So this is what you actually run, like over on the IBM I, we will say Python and then run server.py from the command line in Q shell or bash. And that actually starts this application, and it starts it on whatever port that you specify. So like in this case, this one's set up to start on port 5555, and then it runs. So that's the only thing this thing is good for. That's about all you ever have to look at it, unless you're tweaking some of the ports or any of that sort of stuff. So what happens when you run that, what it does is it calls in this particular file. This is like a first load file that happens when your application runs. You'll see when we look at our real application, there's actually configuration settings that we pull in. Think of it like your zinit in an RPG program, right? Or you're pulling in settings from a settings file or something like that when your application starts up. That would typically be done in this file. And so our live example will show that. Since this is hello world, it doesn't have that in place yet. We also, I guess I'll show this when we look at our other project, but there's a config.py file which holds all of our configuration settings that we want to store on the web server. I tend to try and store as few things in that as possible, and store as much as I can in the database. So that way, if somebody were to gain access, let's say to your web server, you don't want sensitive passwords or something like that living inside of your configuration file. So basically mainly a connection string, and that's about it. And then the mainline program, which is called views HTML. So this is what we'll be spending most of our time looking at this in our other application, but you'll see in here, so this is basically almost like if you run your RPG program, brings in components that it needs, like maybe it's binding some service programs, but in this case, we're doing what they call an import. So we're importing some date time functionality, some template functionality, and then it just goes through the first pass and it pre-compiles all this stuff. So basically, this route says, if somebody passes me like the website with no URL or a website with a /home, it's going to perform this logic. And so going back to our analogy on execute format, think of this as the idea that you're doing an execute format. So it's called render template, but basically in this case, it's rendering out an HTML page, right? So very similar to execute format. So if you start thinking about that as the same analogy, I think it fits. And then there's a contact page and an about page. So this particular program is pretty simple. So let's run it and see what it looks like. So as we were talking about there, it's running my web server when I push play. And this is what it looks like. So pretty nice looking dashboard right out of the box that they provide you with. And this is all Bootstrap framework. So I don't know if they don't have a link to Bootstrap out here, but if you just, I think it's getbootstrap.com, you can learn about all the cool things that you can do with the Bootstrap framework with simple HTML statements. So, and I don't know if you're like me, but I'm not a very good visual designer. But being able to use components like this are nice because I can focus on the business logic and then, not have to worry about the HTML page because Bootstrap does a lot of this for me. So you can render a menu, that sort of stuff. And there's our simple about page. And you'll see, so when we actually, like if you look in the bottom left, I can't point to there because my mouse is up top, but it says localhost /contact. So typically you're not, like normally for a website, you might have contact.html or contact. Because the Python app is actually, these are called routes, we don't need an extension. We just basically pass that portion of it, and then it will automatically route us to the next portion of the page.
Hey, Richard.
So, yes.
This is Laura. Hey, we had a question about links to the files and stuff. I guess we'll have those after.
Correct. I haven't finished.
It out to everybody.
Yep. Yeah, I have to package that up, and then when we send out links to the video, we can do that as well. So I'll post them on my website, and then I'll share the link with you once I have it all set up. So you'll be able to just pretty much unzip that package. I haven't decided. I might just put it on a GitHub site too. To I guess whichever way works.
Okay.
It'll either be on my GitHub site or zip file will provide. Yep, definitely. And the
Awesome.
and the slides, if somebody wants them to, we'll share those as well.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. Any other questions while we're at a pause point so far? Everybody still tracking with us?
All right. So this entire page that we're seeing here was generated from your project. The part that says getting started, get more libraries, Microsoft Azure, Flask, learn more, or so the whole page.
Yeah, so remember when we did our new project and we said create a Flask web project? Remember right at the beginning? So this is, Microsoft actually has a template that they provide where these placeholders are already there and they put a little data in it just so it looks cool. So I'll actually show you the HTML. That's where, so you were kind of segueing to where I was headed next because I want to show you the actual HTML that it got rendered as well, because I think that, to your point, I think that's we haven't connected with that part yet, right? So all we've seen is this thing run so far. So tell me if this makes sense. So the application ran. We're going to go ahead and stop it, and then so as far as the app structure, it spent all its time over in views, but the HTML that it was actually rendering. So when we did it, Microsoft includes that Flask web project template, and then this layout HTML, that's all that HTML that just got rendered. So you can see, very, very straightforward. There isn't really very much there, but it's using, since we're using this framework called Bootstrap, it actually looked pretty cool, right? Normally that would be just a white page with some blocks on it, but just by including these two links up here, the Bootstrap one most importantly, actually let me move that over a little, that automatically tells, and actually it's not even telling Python to do it, it's just telling the browser that we're using this particular framework, and then these tag headers, or they call them classes, actually control what those visuals look like. So I probably won't go much deeper into it than that because I wasn't planning on covering HTML 101 so much today, but that's why I think, and we certainly could do a follow-up class even on just Bootstrap in general. But as you can see, that whole page was rendered just with a couple lines of HTML, right? And this comprises that whole page that you just saw.
Now I see where it's coming from. I see. Okay. I was just, this helped. That answered my question very well. Thank you.
Yeah, awesome. And one of the things you'll see here, so when we talked about Jinja, the template language, right? So we're going to be using some tags. This is what they do. So like you can actually have, I think of this as like scan and replace tags when I'm outputting like a file or something like that. I've done a lot of document sort of stuff where I've generated Word documents from Word templates and PDFs and that sort of stuff over the years. This is sort of that similar syntax in that you can intersperse real live data right in the middle of your HTML as it's outputting it as well. So like this does some, I think this is like I forget what URL4 means, but it's like a URL scrubber. You'll have to look up the Jinja 10 syntax for that one, but so they put that in there. And so the other important thing about this is that it's called a layout page. And so since we're not going deep into HTML, think of it as, we used to use the term master page, but so anytime it ran our, and I'm going to run this to show that illustrated. So when we ran this application, this top part is actually always coming from that layout page. So in other words, that HTML that paints this part of it only lives in that top layout page. And then actually, I think this comes out from index HTML. So in other words, you don't have to be replicating HTML every time you go out, because the first thing it does when it paints the page is it paints layout HTML, which gives you sort of the framework. And it'll become more apparent when you see my other example because it's got the dashboard in it. But then it paints the bottom part as the actual flexible stuff. So like if I click on about, you'll see it repainted that. It looks the same. And then it just painted a few words of text in that particular case because that one was really simple. But it keeps you from having to have the same HTML over and over in all your pages. So they use the term in Python. It's called a layout page. We used in Visual Studio for C# and whatever, we used to call it a master page. But so it's just a different term that they use for it. So this actually, to go back to what we were talking about, this paints that top part of the page, but this index actually painted, there's your verbiage, right? You know, you were asking about the paragraphs. And so that's just a couple divs of information. And because we told it was a row and it has 4 columns going across, it just nicely interspersed those across our screen for us. And that was, again, none of that's Python itself. That's just the Bootstrap HTML framework doing that for us. So you can see when it paints, so like when you went to the home page and went to index, there's a couple extra tags that become important at the top. Every page that you use, you'll just make sure you put this up at the top. So what that says is draw that top bar layout in all the time from layout.html. So if I ever make a site change to my overall theme, I just change it over in this layout.html, and all my pages will inherit that at the top of their pages. And then when you actually put out the HTML, it's called block content. So like there's a top tag for block content, and then there's an end block. So everything in between there is called a block of text. And back in the layout area, and you might have to listen to this if you're not tracking with it, go through the video again and see it, but you'll see when the layout page goes out, it actually includes that index.html page right here. And it includes that, it basically sandwiches it right into the HTML using those tags. And that's where the importance of that template language comes in, because now every one of your pages, and you're going to see even when we do our list page in our real application, they become very simple to put together. And then if you take an application that you've completed and say, hey, I want to do a variation of this, you can just do a save as on one of your existing applications, change out the tables, change the names to protect the innocent, and you can have all kinds of different applications that are using this template syntax and using Python. The other, did that help with the HTML page analogy?
That worked fine.
Okay, cool. Just want to make sure that so templates, and this directory needs to be named templates, so you don't need to change that when you do your projects. And then static is where you're going to have, so if you do have static HTML pages, or like in our case, there's some Bootstrap CSS that's coming in, all your static files live under there. So there's some fonts that you can bring in that Bootstrap uses. If we're putting JavaScripts in there, we put them in a scripts folder. And so that's kind of a suggested layout that the Flask framework uses. So it keeps it pretty simple, but also pretty organized as well. And then your code files end up sort of in the main part of the project here. All right, that's hello world. Let's go. So I'm not going to do this from scratch. So because you guys are going to get this template anyways. What I'm going to do is walk through because our real application actually has some other cool functionality. Plus, I'm cognizant of our time as well, because I could probably talk for 2 more hours on this stuff if we really wanted to. But let's go. We're going to pull up. So the project, and this will be the one we share with you. So it's called Flask Web Project IBMI. Pretty straightforward for that meeting. So you'll see it's got, so there's a bunch of stuff there. Actually, let's close these for a second because we'll start. So going back to here, run server, pretty much the same. It's a little different. Actually, I don't think, yeah. So the one thing I changed here, I wanted to be able to, often when you're doing web development, if you're doing it in Visual Studio, by default, it'll put something like this in there, right? So what's going to happen if I do that? I can only test on my PC, but I can't have other people try and hit that application. So just by changing, so basically it's listening to that IP address, which every PC, every IBMI, anything that runs a TCP IP stack has that as their local address. So normally what I do is I put it to a specific, basically this says listen on port 5556 on any IP address that I have on my PC. So basically I could have, if I had other people who knew my desktop address, they could actually be testing my web application for me as well, even though I'm running it in my development environment. So that's kind of a nice way to turn that on. So I always tend to, oh yeah, and you'll see I actually have commented out there about work on localhost, but I tend to do it this way because I like it to monitor on all addresses. Or if you had 2 apps on, let's say on your IBMI, you had 2 or 3 different IP addresses and there were some port conflicts, you can put in a specific IP address for it to monitor as well. But 0000 will just monitor, says if I got 2 or 3 or 4 IP addresses, monitor that same port on all of them. All right, so, and then, so in the init, remember that was our next thing that happens when it starts up. There's a few things that we added in here this time around. So you'll see it brings in, and this is a Python convention or Flask convention. This scenario here actually is pulling in and creating a configuration object by reading my configuration file. So Python says that you have to have the file named config.py, which is how we named ours. And then let's see, hold on a second. So let's open that up so you can see it. So you can see in here, these are actually, so you basically, they have some syntax that you use, and as long as you adhere to that, I even put a little README, so if you want to go look at this web link, but these become variables that are available in your program. So like in my case, I had like an application title, I had a copyright that I wanted to put in there, I'm going to use some session cookies. Also down here, I had some scenarios where I'm using my SQLite database, so I have a path set to that. And then I'm also doing my ODBC connection string in here as well, so if I happen to be connected to an IBMI. And then this switch, so if it's set to IBMI, it's going to use our client access ODBC database driver. If I set it to SQLite, it will actually use the SQLite driver. So what's cool is this application, the goal was that you could use it with IBMI or without, right? You know, maybe you use SQL Server, maybe you use MySQL, who cares? This same app will work on any of those databases and really any platform where you want to run it too. So, you know, it was kind of meant to be IBMI yet anywhere. So you can see those are our settings. So that's cool. And then let's go into the main program just to see. So this is going to be fleshed out a bit more than what we had in that hello world, but you're going to see it's roughly the same. So there's some core functionality that I wanted to bring in, like because we're doing a web service, I included there's a JSON functionality. There's some system things you can do to check date and time. And then these are some of the specific Flask options that you might want to bring into the application. So, you know, again, think of it like a service program. You're using functionality in RPG in a service program. I think of these imports as the same type of thing. Hey, we need to use our Flask functionality. I need to do some JSON. And then these two down here are the specific ones that I created. I called my database class for the IBMI is DB-IBMI. And you'll see that that hides all my SQL queries and inserts and updates, deletes, so they don't have to be in my mainline code. And then DB SQLite, which is basically the SQLite version of that. So we're bringing that into our application. And then you'll see in here, when you read, I don't tend to like the syntax when you're reading from the configuration, because they assume it's an array, and that thing keeps popping up, and that it's a named element like app name and whatnot. So the first thing I tend to do is I move it into a work variable. This would be, think of it like a dspec at the top of your program, right? I'm defaulting that app name field to app.config app name, so I don't have to use that same long syntax all throughout my program. So I just shortened it into app name, and I shortened it into app copyright and connection string and library, because I've got a data library I want to use. But what's important about this is you don't see anything that declares these variables. Just by using these, like I said, app name equals, Python automatically declares that in memory for me. Remember we talked about it, it declares it, and it sets it as the return type of whatever it is. So like in this case, it's going to be a string. But if it was a database connection, it might be a database object or something like that. So that's like I said earlier, that's one of the things I don't like, but it's just something you have to get used to. Anytime you set a variable, it just creates it for you right at that point in time. So these happen to be things I want to be accessible globally, much like I would with a dspec in an RPG. So I set them up here at the top. And then now we just start rolling through here. I've got some notes in there. Don't connect database quite yet. I haven't figured these out, so if you get a chance to read about them, this is supposed to actually allow you to, so there's a thing in Python called app before request and app after request, where you can trigger functionality. This would be my ideal place to have my database connection, but there were some oddities I was finding where it was like launching, it was opening a database connection twice and triggering that event twice. So it was causing some issues. So I chose not to use it for now, but just know that's there. So like when a request comes in, before you do any of your routes, you can actually have specific logic that runs if you want to. In my case, ideally, I'd like to use the database there, so I left those commented out. But for now, I will leave those out, and you'll see where we connect to our database. So, and then I tend to like that. Maybe this comes from my VB days or from my commenting days in RPG, but some people like to comment really simply. I always like to have dashes that separate my code, because it's nice to know where that visual separation is. So this is my subroutine, or my, in this case, my route, my function, whatever you want to call it, that does the home page, right? So like we talked about, if it's a root or home, and if it's a get or a post to that, we're going to actually call this home function, which outputs our index page, right? So we did an execute format, and then it drops out. So basically, as far how these routes work is it says perform this block and then drop out. So it's like a main line, right? It says do this and drop out, you're done. And so that was my home page. So I left the contact page sample that we had in there. So that was another simple. I think I left the about page in there as well, just to show as illustrations of, you know, probably some simple static pages that don't really need any logic. You can just output a plain old HTML page that way. In this one, so I have a dashboard view one that I did as well, which you'll see. It's got some cool gauges in there that you can see. And then there's a login page. I have not implemented the login page. I probably will on a future iteration of this, but I did put a placeholder where, you know, maybe you'd have a login page that they click a button and then show the login page and do some login logic. So I haven't done validation yet on that, but I will do a future version of that, because I'm going to be doing it for some of the actual real apps that I'm putting together for this. And then you have actual logic. So I'm going to show that. So I want to show them in reverse order. So there's the detail page. We're going to come back to that in a second and just talk through that real quick. We'll come back to the update and talk through it real quick. And then the only other one is our subfile list, right? So this is kind of like building out our subfile, and just go through it and we'll come back to it. And then this is actually our web service, and we'll be talking about that in a second. Look at how small our web service is, just a few lines of code in there. And then this tables one, it actually is just doing displaying some HTML functionality that we want to see as well, which I'll show you when we run it. And then you can actually have your own custom error pages. So in web app, a 404 is typically an error. So you can have like your own custom error handler, like I did here for the error 404. I think 401 and error 500 are sort of your common errors. So this whole main line is all about choosing which screen to show, right? It comes in and then it runs those. But before I actually deconstruct anymore of it, I want to actually have you see the app in action, because I think that'll add better context to what we're talking about. So let's run it. So that's pretty cool looking, isn't it? So I found this template. I think there's a site called Bootstrap Zero, but I was just, and if you Google this, it's like free Bootstrap templates, and there's paid ones too that you might pay like 10 or 20 bucks for. But I tend to like this style of interface is, they call it sort of an admin style interface, and I always think of it as sort of Outlookish. In other words, I've got some stuff that might be at the top. You know, I can hook up this menu. None of this is actually functional because it came as part of the template, but you can have, you know, menus up at the top. I could put a search bar in there. Then I can have options along the side. So this admin template could be the structure for a whole application that you built. Like let's say you built an order entry app, or you built a customer online app or something like that. You know, it's kind of a nice structure for, you know, I need to log into a site. I need to do a couple different things, right? And we were talking earlier about, so this is straight up Bootstrap. So this is cool. Like if you got a dashboard, like maybe when they log in, you want to show them a dashboard that has some real data on it. This is just calling it a simple JavaScript chart. And I'm not going to go deep into that. You can peek into the HTML and play with it, but these are all just freely available controls that you feed a little data to. You got a pretty compelling looking dashboard, you know. I was talking with somebody the other day about having, you know, sliders that move things around and that too. So you can make these very interactive, but with very little HTML. So I just left this in there because it was part of their default one, and I thought it was visually compelling because for little effort, you can build lots of bang for the buck. So imagine if you have a CIO or a CEO or a CFO that you need to show some information to, and they want to see it in a nice looking format, right? They're complaining about the green screen. Well, you don't need to go out and modernize everything that you have just because of that. Maybe you got a bunch of green screen stuff, but give them this and go, this just came out of our IBM I. All we did is put a little web app on it for you. You know, make it sound cool, like you just slapped something together and just like that, and took advantage of our modern platform on IBM I. So anyways, that's the dashboard, and you can always click back here. I do have an issue with it. For some reason, it's refreshing incorrectly when I do that. So I'll fix that though before I post the code. But as you go down, there's another one called Charts, which actually just shows you, this is just a bigger version of that chart too, right? And it's got some pie charts in there. So very cool if you wanted to build dashboards. The other thing you could do, and I've done this, I call it a poor man's dashboard, is you can put in HTML, they have an auto refresh tag too. So let's say it was sitting up on somebody's desktop, or let's say out on the shop floor or in the accounting department, whatever, they have a big screen where they want to keep this showing. You could actually have an HTML refresh tag that refreshes this every 5 or 10 seconds or something like that. And it's very cool and very powerful for showing dashboard sorts of things. All right, so let's look at our code that actually does something in here. So the important part for this app for today is we created a maintenance application on our QCust CDT component. So we're going to click on customers, and you'll see it brings us up a subfile type of list. I can go through here and just do a search, and I can list all of the records that I have in there if I want to. If I want to do, let's say, type in a partial last name, I can do something like that. And we're doing just simple SQL filtering, right, to be able to filter our data. Maybe I want to see the whole list again, or I want to do a new record from here. But let's go ahead and click in so you can see on the detail. You know, this is sort of the, you know, every time we build a sample or we're learning a new technology, you write a CRUD application, right, to enter some data. So this is nice because it shows you some nice looking fields in here. I can do update and delete. And in some cases, you may have scenarios where you want to, some users may or may not be able to see an update or delete button, right? You just want them to view it, but very standardized data entry application. I got it in debug mode, so we'll continue here for a second. I was testing that earlier, and there's our SQL. And then when it's done, it returns back to the main screen. And then if you do a new record, it just shows you all your fields, right? So we'll just do just for fun, we'll use me, I guess. All right, so I can just enter the data that I want, and got our debug mode again because we were testing, and then it saves that record, and then we'll call it up just to, oh, I had one in there already, but now I have a different customer number. But so a good pattern, and I purposely kept this very simple data entry because you know, this is what you would do in a subfile, right? So tomorrow you could build a query application for your users that use this interface very easily just by switching out the SQL that I put in here. And same thing with if you wanted to do a database maintenance page as well. There's an alternate, so that tables when we were that data table sample we were looking at. There's a JavaScript control. Actually, I think it might be straight HTML, but it's called data table. So this is one I came up with, and I was just using some bootstrap formatting. But this data table, I just fed it a list of data, and it actually does all this formatting for me into a kind of a grid format as well. And so I just told it to include all my columns in this particular one, and it does all that formatting for me into a nice grid format as well. And then I did the same thing where, you know, I can hyperlink and go into the maintenance page from there as well. But as you start playing around with it, you know, you'll get a feel for how this works. But let's go take a quick look through the code just to show you how simple that was. And it's just an extension of what we've done so far. We've just added some database stuff to it now. So I'm going to start with the list because that one's the coolest in terms of simplicity. So when I click that URL on the left, what happens is basically it has a link that says go to /qcuscdt list, and that what happens is then comes in here, runs this, and says, oh, he wants a list page. In my connect to the database, you'll see, remember we had that switch where it said IBMI or SQLite. It just says, if my DB type is IBMI, we're going to use our IBMI database. If it's SQLite, use that. And you'll notice because these are declared dynamically, I use the same variable name. So if I happen to be using IBMI, it magically makes that an IBMI connection for me. If it's SQLite, even though it's a different class, it automatically assumes the DB SQLite. So that is one of the powerful things about these untyped things is I don't have to worry about tracking, oh yeah, that was a IBMI object, and this one was an SQLite. This is the only code difference that I made for this particular application to make it work across those two databases. So the rest, you know, because my field names and everything are exactly the same, the rest just works, right? Just by swapping those databases out. And so now you'll see, so like they clicked to go to that page. The way I have this one set up is by default, it looks to see, did they do a search? And that's what would happen during a post, like if they click the search button. So if they did a search, we'd basically pull the information. This is how you pull information from those form fields. You use the syntax request.form, and then those field names are customer number and last name, or in this case, I guess custom and last name. So we actually pull them from the form into variables, so they make them a little easier to work with. And then this is just a simple, you probably do this in your RPG subfiles today, right? If the customer number is not equal to blank, we're going to go ahead and run this query and pass it a where criteria of customer number equals that. And then we're going to fetch all the records that match that. If instead it's the last name, same variation, different where criteria. And then if they didn't enter anything, we're just going to do a query and bring back all our records, or maybe a page or two if you had it set up that way. And then if nothing was found, we actually throw up an error on the screen. And then if we found data, we actually render our template, right? Remember our execute format, we output our screen, and that spits out that whole grid for us. So that's all you have to do. And then if they happen to be doing a get rather than that, we just display the screen, right? Because that means we're just showing the screen for the first time. So there's no actual business logic there. But here's where it becomes really powerful. So look at the page that we have, qcuscdt list. So this is the HTML for a list. That's it. So any list that you do in your web applications will be a variation of this. So what this does, this outputs my top part. So think of this as your subfile control area, right? I'm going to output a input field called iCustom. I'm going to output a last name and then a search button, so you can actually do a search. And then I'm going to actually output a table, and because I'm using Bootstrap, if I just give it this class, it's going to style it with the alternating stripe look and feel for me. And you'll see here, I'm just putting out a simple table header for 3 columns, custom, last name, initials. And then this is where the power of this syntax language comes in. So this is that Jinja template language coming to bear again. So it says, if I have some results, which means results not equal to none, we're going to go ahead and do a loop, and we're going to loop through each record, and we're going to create a variable called row, and we're going to loop through it until we run out of records, and we're going to output these table rows, and then we're out of here. And so this is the syntax, as you can see, for being able to pull, like, so that's my custom, that's my last name. I just use the word row and put some brackets around it and the field name. And I can call in any field that was in that SQL query and format it anywhere in this page. But as you can see, this list page is really, really, really simple. All right, because I want to be cognizant of time, I'm not going to go through the data updates and all that sort of stuff. So I'm going to leave that for y'all to look at that on your own. But you know, the detail page is almost a variation of that. There's just a list of all of our detail fields. We use the same field names as we do in the database. I tend to try and stay consistent, right? I use my same field names on my screens that I use in the database, or like sometimes I'll use like P as a prefix, like P last name for a parameter, or I last name if I want to on an input field. So, you know, whatever your favorite formatting strategy is will work there. But yeah, so you'll want to step through and analyze that. And then you'll see this layout page. This was that whole, that template that I got from that Bootstrap site. This is that whole beautiful looking dashboard is all part of our layout page. So any page that we output is by default going to see that layout look and feel. So that just paints every time before it actually paints any of our data. So get a chance to play around with that, and I think you'll find out how powerful this template is with very little work. And then of course make sure to spend a little time on learning Bootstrap as well, just getting comfortable with it. I do want to take before I go look at deploying in the eye, I do also want to show you the database part of it. So much like you have a sub procedure or a service program on IBM I, in most object-oriented languages and Python, you have the concept of a class. So for all best intents, think of it as a service program, and it has functionality in it. We just happen to name ours DB IBM I. Every one of these has sort of its own zinit function that can do some stuff. In this case, we actually create and open our database connection on that. So that's the first thing that happens. And then we've got a little is open checker that checks to see if the database is open. And probably the most important thing, there's our create connection where it's just connecting to the database with that connection string. But probably the most important thing here is going to be the queries that you can do. So there's our close connection. So you've got only two types of queries that you're mainly going to do. If you were to pass, like you were to type all the SQL over in that views page, you can do an SQL execute, which this will do an insert, an update, or a delete with any SQL statement that you pass it, right? So all you got to just pass it an SQL statement, it'll run it, it'll return true or false. The execute query always is returning results. So any SQL you pass it, like we were from our search screen, executes that SQL, creates what we call a cursor, which means we can actually access that data that was just queried, and then it returns it back so that that mainline program can actually do something with the data. So a lot of this, you can see very simplified, and I borrowed a lot of these from Python samples too. So you'll find, like, I know SQLite has a whole site on how to build stuff around it for database. So a lot of these are modeled just after that. But for your actual database stuff, this is the important CRUD stuff, is I tend to use, like in this case, insert into qcustcdt, pass it all the field names, right? You know, very simple. So I pass the field names in when I call this, and then it builds out my SQL. This is actually a template that builds this insert statement for me. And so you can see it's building out, there's my fields. And then anywhere I have %s, right? So those are placeholders. And then I actually pass these data values, and they end up in each of those placeholders, which in the end, I have a beautiful insert statement with all of my data in it. And then it just executes that. So very simple, build SQL statement, run it, 2 lines. So really it's more commentary than it is anything else. And same thing with the update, does an update based on the same type of thing. The only difference there is that when you do an update, the customer number, if that's our key, you have to make sure that we include that as our where custom equals %s in this case. So you can see we update the custom number in this case, but then we use it again towards the end with the same field name, because that becomes our where statement for that too. It's where customer number equals this value. And then finally, the delete, right? So we want to do a delete, easy enough. And there's a get exists. I always like this too, because I can actually check if a record exists by passing it, like in this case, a customer number. It'll actually go out and do a count for me and tell me if the record exists. This is always just kind of a nice utility to have. And then query. So I made a more generic one for QCUS-CDT, where all I have to pass in is the where statement, and then it's building out the select all from my library, QCUS-CDT, and then it has a where statement. So the SQLite one is exactly the same, but hopefully that makes sense. Any questions? Well, I'm going to transition over to the IBM I so we can actually look at deployment on I, but any questions on what I've shown so far? I know it's hard to do all this in an hour and a half, but hopefully as you guys start going forward, you can come back and listen to this recording and get some context as you're learning this.
Where would you put your edits? Meaning, I'm verifying that you're only putting in the 50 states. Am I putting that edit over on the IBM I side, on the server side, or in these scripts?
Well, probably in today's world, they were. I would probably do. Have you heard the concept of AJAX calls or single page applications? This is stepping maybe into mobile, almost into mobile development. But one way is to do it when you post. That, like you said, that's so. The other way is you can do what are called AJAX calls, which means like when I enter that data in the field, there's ways of actually making a call without actually having to refresh the whole page. The concept, they're called AJAX calls. I could actually reach out to the I series. Maybe I had a service that said validate state. So you can call that web service and actually validate some data or do some other sort of business logic, and it brings it right back to your screen, so it doesn't actually have to repaint or go through that whole cycle of click, enter, go through the main view page and all that sort of stuff. That's generally how I would do it. You can also do it on the submit too, like when you submit the data, you could have some logic in there that validates and then spits the page back out as well. I'll make a note to actually add a couple of validations in there against our web service example when I place this out there as well, but because I probably won't get it online till next week when I do a little bit of cleanup on it. But also, if there's stuff that's not database that you want to validate, is in the detail page. Do I have any in this one? I just think we just have links. There's rules in it, and this is just HTML5. This is nothing with Python or anything else. HTML5 has all kinds of validation rules and even help context they can give you to make sure fields are blank or not blank. So you can do a lot of that even without having logic in there. But I think your scenario where you're looking up data, more than likely I would do an AJAX call on it, which means, as they type, or maybe have a button that they click, whatever, when they click to go ahead and post a transaction, you probably would have some JavaScript in there that's actually calling out to a web service call to do that data validation.
Okay, that's fine. That's the only thing I would say is maybe show me where I want to put my validation. Maybe talk just briefly about it when you finish playing with this.
Yeah. Well, it would be in one of these pages. You probably would have, on the click, like when you do your button click, it would be in there. Since we're short on time, I'm going to go show IBM I deployment just for completeness.
Right. No problem.
But yeah, so I'll add when I post this template, I'll put some code in there and comment it as well. And in fact, I'll make it use what I'll have it do is I'll have it use our little web service that we built in here to actually validate some data. So we'll actually use our own service. And while I'm thinking about that, I just want to show, we do, just for completeness, if you run this application and you want to see the web service, so basically I created a route, I call it API. I tend to put my web service calls a little separated. So this one actually runs, and you'll see, as any web service would, is it's just returning some JSON data from our application. And so I'm going to do the quick review of that here is, so in terms of code, back in this views, let's find I think it's towards the bottom, the web service. Did I go too far? Yeah, let's go right up here. So this shows how, and here's a link on how to do some JSON stuff too. I always tend to intersperse HTML links if you want to go do more reading. But for this route, right? So if they happen to, let's say I had a mobile app or I was doing an AJAX call from one of my other web pages, you'll see this really is no different than our other pages to some extent. It connects to the database. It runs a query. In mine, I'm just querying it at all, but it could be a where statement or something like that, or something else that I want to call. But this example on that URL that I provided, what he does is he takes the results and basically rolls through it and places every field into an array. And there's a thing built into Python called JSONify. So as you can see, I just say, go through each record, add them to an array list. And then this JSONify function just says, blast that out to the browser or return it to my mobile app, whatever, as JSON. So you don't really even need to be a JSON expert, because that one line of code, you've just surfaced the web service just by calling everything that was in this section. And this is agnostic to really any database where you might want to surface data, or maybe you got something where you're just returning a single field, or you call it and you pass some information into it and you need a true or false, right? Was it valid or was it not valid? But so play with this, because you'll get a good feel for how these work. And that's one of the things I like about Python too, is pretty drop dead simple to do some of these web service type of things. All right, promised web service, so we got to see that. So let's go over to our IBM I. So one of the things you may want to get, this is a cool, are any of you familiar, have any of you worked with like an SSH client or anything like that so far? I'm not going to go deep into it, but there's two ways you can typically get in and run your application. You can do it from the green screen if you want, but this is a tool called MOBA Xterm, so it's MOBA Xterm. I found this a while back, but it allows me to get in and run Q shell command line, or in this case, a bash command line on the IBM I. But you'll notice I also have access to my IFS, right? So I can go check out stuff in my IFS, and I can edit files from here as well. So it's kind of a nice utility. Python Magic. So it's a nice utility for browsing and editing files. So like, let's say I needed to edit this guy, I can actually open it in the text editor. I can make changes and save it back, which I'm not going to right now. But so it's got its own built-in editor. You can work at the command line. There's a file explorer you can view. I installed, this is called Midnight Commander. Any of you that worked back in the DOS days probably have seen this before, but it's kind of like, so I'm actually on my IBM I, I'm browsing through the file system on that. So this is kind of a neat little utility that you can install. But I guess what I wanted to point out here is, you can see, all I did is I lifted my Visual Studio project. I took everything, even that is my SLN file. I don't see my SLN file. Yeah, maybe I didn't bring that, but I pulled everything, basically all the files from my project and the whole structure, I pulled over to here. Oh, actually, it's probably down in there. So you can see here, all my templates, there's my views page, or my views file, all those templates that we were looking at. All I did is took that whole directory and I copied and pasted it. I created one called Python Magic, since we were doing our Magic group session today. And so by just doing that and making one change, so what I changed here is, you'll see I'm using my ODBC driver that's on my IBM I. This is the syntax that I can specify. So I've installed the IBM I access driver on my IBM I. And by saying DSN local, it's automatically assuming I'm connecting to the local IBM I when I run this out of my IFS. So the upshot is, bottom line is, you change to that directory. So if you can do this from Q shell as well, like you do start QSH, the Python Magic. And like Visual Studio was doing this automatically for us, but once if you got Python installed and all the prereqs, you just type Python 3 run server. And header, sorry, do I already have that running? Ooh, maybe I have that running somewhere already. I didn't think I had it over on the green screen. Let's do this. We'll change we're actually gonna get to change something here. So we'll say we're gonna go up one, actually down there. And it was in our run server, I believe. There we go. All right, so we'll change it. We'll make it, we're pretty unique. We'll go 55, 57. I must have had that already submitted in the background somewhere. So I just made that change. That actually saved it back right directly to my IFS. And now let's run this guy again, and hopefully it'll run for us. So you'll see it started, it's monitoring all my IP, or on my IP address, it's monitoring that port. So I can actually go out and go sys I1, what was it, 5557, right? 5557. And there's the same application we were just doing from our desktop, but it's being served out of my IBM I. Also, sub-second response time into my database. So, you know, in terms, we used to use the term sub-second response time. This stuff, easy to build and easy to run, and it's fast. You know, so as long as you got a decent performing IBM I that runs Python well, you can deploy that easy just by copying that directory out there, making sure all the prerequisites are installed, and then you can run it directly. Couple things I just want to note before we wrap up is that I want to show some slides here. Hold on a second. We're going to go back to our slides for a sec. So if you're deploying on IBM I, so a couple prereqs is you'll want to install, and I wasn't going to do a tutorial on this, but install the open source package management component. And then what you're going to do then after that is you're going to install, make sure you install Python 3. That's one of the options that shows up when you install for packages you can install. And then you're going to want to install the Unix ODBC driver option, because that allows us to use the IBM I Access ODBC driver. And then you'll want to download this package from the IBM I Access site as well. So it's basically the ACS Pace app package that has the ODBC driver to run natively on the I already part of it. And so once you've done that, then you can actually install. So basically, after you install it, what you will do is you'll basically download it, and then you upload it into the IFS, and then basically run these commands. So if you go to either QP2 term, or if you do it in bash like I did it, or start Q shell, you run this sequence of commands, and there's, I think they're on version 13 now, but wherever whatever the file name is, you just replace that in there. That actually installs the ODBC, the IBM I Access ODBC driver. So a couple of just small command line things that you might need to do to make that happen, but it's pretty straightforward. And that basically installs it for you, and then you're ready to start testing. So it's pretty straightforward. There's probably a few other things you may need help with, but there's a lot of good info online. I'm always happy if you have a question, you send me an email, and I'm always happy to point you in the right direction as well, because there's a lot of good content out there. And so a couple useful web links. I'll put that up there just so it's in the recording, but it'll be in the deck when we share it with you as well. Any questions before we wrap up? I know we're coming right up on the hour. I just want to make sure I was mindful of time today, but was this helpful? Well, would you like to see more of this type of stuff? Any specific questions that you might have?
Yeah, for myself, calling in from London, I think it's a really great session. Thank you for giving us an overview of how to connect, obviously, the Python, the HTML, and web app. So thank you for myself. I'll reach out to you separately if I've got any other questions. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks for attending. All right. So well, I guess if there's nothing else, so we learned how to develop web apps in Flask and Visual Studio, and of course you can pick your editor of choice, but I like Visual Studio. We learned how to use the IBM I ODBC connectivity and the native connectivity, which has been with us for about a year with Python on the IBM I, and then of course how to deploy our Flask application on the I. So the only thing I'll leave you with is make sure you get started once we send out the links for the deck and the application.